Australian government policies towards Australia's First Nations people can be split into several periods of time, beginning with the Declaration of Terra Nullius to the present day and the approaching 2023 referendum. In 1770, Captain James Cook raised the British flag at Possession Island and declared Australia as Terra Nullius, followed by Captain Arthur Phillip and the First Fleet arriving in 1788 and beginning the colonisation of Australia. Despite the British Declaration of Terra Nullius, many people, including John Batman, recognized the First Nations people's land rights. In 1835, John Batman attempted to purchase land from First Nations people through a treaty, but the New South Wales governor at the time, Sir Richard Burke, disallowed this and issued a proclamation that people found in the possession of land without the authority of government would be considered trespassers, reinforcing the notion that no one owned the land prior to British colonisation. In 1840, a British Parliamentary Select Committee published a report on the situation of Aboriginal people living across its colonies across the world, including in Australia. The report specifically recommended that the colonies in Australia appointed protectors of Aborigines, partly due to the frontier wars between First Nations people and white settlers, resulting in massacres that would only get more organised over time, resulting in the next 2 centuries of laws that established authorities to restrict the freedoms of First Nation people for their supposed best interest that they would one day be assimilated into the white community. Each colony enacted laws independently, but for the purposes of this video, different states passing similar laws won't be mentioned. In 1869, Victoria passed the Aboriginal Protection Act, establishing the Board for the Protection of Aborigines, who were given control over where First Nations people lived and worked, as well as what was done with their wages. A list of powers that would rapidly grow by the end of the 19th century, similar to New South Wales' own Board for the Protection of Aborigines, which when they were established in 1883 did not have any legal power and were limited to areas pointed out by Premier Alex Stewart, such as the creation and management of reserves and the distribution of rations, clothing, and blankets. It also provided boats and fishing equipment for coastal First Nations people and farming equipment for those who lived on inland reserves, as agricultural production was something the board saw as a civilizing activity. The list of powers would grow to include taking custody of orphan First Nations children when Western Australia passed the Aborigines Protection Act in 1886. The trend continued in 1897 when Queensland authorised the forceful relocation of any First Nations person to a reserve under the Aboriginals Protection and Restriction of the Sale of Opium Act. At the turn of the century, with the Federation of Australia, it was believed that First Nations culture would die out and that the population would assimilate into white society. First Nations peoples were barely mentioned in the Constitution, only referred to twice to leave the making of Aboriginal policy to the state and to exclude them from being counted with the rest of the population in the census, although they were counted separately. The next year, the Commonwealth Franchise Act allowed women to vote, but it specifically disqualified people of coloured races, including First Nations people, from voting, a step forward for women's suffrage and another back for racial equality. In 1905, Western Australia passed the Aborigines Act, which created the position of a Chief Protector, who became the legal guardian of every First Nations and half-caste child under the age of 16, causing for distressing scenes of children being separated from their families, who would later be known as the Stolen Generation. After nearly a century of having First Nations people live on reserves, government policies began to loosen, beginning with Tasmania in 1912, encouraging First Nations people to live outside of reserves when the Cape Barren Island Reserve Act was passed. In 1937, assimilation became the official national policy in Australia after the first Commonwealth and State Conference on Aboriginal Welfare. However, most states were still increasing the amount of control authorities had over the lives of First Nations people. In the aftermath of World War II, a war in which First Nations people were allowed to fight in, the newly formed United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, a move that was supported by Australia. The injustice of denying First Nations people the right to vote while allowing them to die for the country was clear to many. So, in 1949, the Commonwealth Electoral Act was passed, allowing First Nations people who have served in the Defence Force or had already been allowed to vote in state elections to vote in Commonwealth elections, extending the right to vote to First Nations people living in every state apart from Western Australia and Queensland, where they were only allowed to vote after 1965. In 1967, a decisive referendum was held, resulting in the biggest yes vote in Australian history. A referendum that had so much support that a no case was never presented in the referendum campaign. More than 90% of the voting population of Australia voted yes to removing discriminatory provisions in the Constitution and allowing First Nations people to be in the same count as other Australian citizens in the census, and allowing the federal parliament to create laws on their behalf. Soon after the referendum, states would abolish their respective authorities that were previously in charge of assimilation of First Nations people, marking significant steps towards equality. Reparations would officially begin in 1972 when the Labour Party made First Nation land rights part of its policies during its successful federal election campaign. This was followed by the passing of the Racial Discrimination Act in 1975, making it unlawful to discriminate on the basis of race, colour, descent, or national or ethnic origin, a stride towards equality for all people of colour, including First Nations people. Continuing the push for reparations, the Aboriginal Land Rights Northern Territory Act was passed in 1976 by a federal parliament with bipartisan support, which was the first legislation in Australia that allowed First Nations people to claim land titles if the traditional association could be proven, resulting in Uluru being handed back to its traditional owners, the Anangu people, in 1985. Then, in 1992, the infamous doctrine of terra nullius was overturned by the High Court in the Mabo v Queensland case. The decision recognized the native title right of First Nations people and paved the way for the Native Title Act to be passed in 1993, leading to successful native title claims across the country. Although reparations concerning land rights continued to be made into the 21st century, the focus shifted to a formal process of reconciliation, specifically with the stolen generation. In 1996, the Commonwealth Parliament issued a statement of commitment to reconciliation, and the next year, in 1997, the 700-page Bringing Them Home report was released, investigating the history and impact of the stolen generation, and making 54 recommendations to support healing and reconciliation. The same year, Prime Minister John Howard made a personal apology to the stolen generation, but refused to make an official apology on behalf of Australia, although each state would issue statements recognizing and publicly apologizing to the stolen generation. In 2006, Tasmania set up the first Stolen Generation Compensation Scheme in Australia with the passing of the Stolen Generations of Aboriginal Children Act. The formal national apology finally came in 2008 when Prime Minister Kevin Rudd delivered the national apology to the stolen generation, which expressed a commitment to close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. For the most part, assimilation remained part of policies passed by government, as First Nations peoples are to live by legal and political systems set up by non-Indigenous people, without any autonomy as the original culture of Australia over what is done at the national level, resulting in a push for legal recognition of First Nations people as the first inhabitants of Australia, which was granted as part of the 2013 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander People Recognition Act, which also laid out Parliament's intention for recognition to happen at the constitutional level, which requires a referendum to take place. The referendum, if successful, would establish a representative body for the First Nations people in Parliament. This body would offer non-binding advice to Parliament on policies and laws that affect First Nation people. However, unlike the referendum in 1967, the upcoming referendum does not have bipartisan support, which would ultimately leave the choice to the Australian people, when the referendum is expected to be held sometime in 2023.